old Isaac Haight farm, which was what Millbrook was built on. We see a deed dated February 20th, 1869, transferred a large portion of the Isaac Haight farm from his widow Hannah to a Matthew Franklin Merritt for $21,000. The village was laid out predominantly by Franklin Merritt between 1865 and 1869. He had a great incentive to develop the land because he knew of the plans to build a railroad through the area, which was brought to the area by George Hunter Brown, whose estate is Millbrook's namesake. He lived on Millbrook Farms, which is on Route 44 and Shady Dell Road. The house, I think, is still there. I don't know if you know the house where the McHughes live, but that's...
With the fence around it?
Yeah, with the fence around it.
And the creek runs through.
Yeah, there's a creek. At the bottom of the hill where he built the house, there was a mill on a brook which flowed through a corner of his property, hence the name Millbrook. He actually continued to buy properties around him and ended up owning 500 acres. When the railroad came through Millbrook, Franklin Merritt formed the Millbrook Land and Improvement Company, and they began to lay out the streets in the new village that grew up around the station between the years 1865 and 1869. So not only did Franklin Merritt develop the small town, but he named two of the main streets after himself rather shamelessly. Another interesting fact is that though the plans were assembled in the 1860s, it wasn't until 1895 that Millbrook officially became an incorporated village. Next we're going to move to Friendly Lane, which is where we all met in the beginning. This is probably a confusing name to a lot of people unless that you know that there was once a Friends Quaker house in the parking lot where we were standing before. That later turned to the Knights of Columbus meeting house, and that building is no longer there. And my dad is giving a speech on that. What day?
August.
Are you ready?
Talking about all the buildings that are no more in Millbrook. So
August
that will be
11th.
Next month. It's on my calendar.
that will be in the presentation.
Well, thank you. I'll be there, so you'll all be there too. Okay?
I think it's on Friendly Lane.
Ashley, this Friendly Lane used to be a Quaker.
Yeah, there's a picture of it right here at the Friends Church, which I can pass. That's the Friends Church that later turned into the Knights of Columbus.
Port kosher.
Off of Friendly Lane is Pilgrim Lane. It actually goes from Church, it did go from Church Street up until Maple Avenue, but it's now divided by the blue house that's next to the library. That portion, which is right there between Friendly and Maple, was the little alley for all the carriages, horse and carriages that were connected to the houses on Franklin and Merritt. We don't know where the name Pilgrim Lane came from. We think it was either because it was next to the Friends Meeting House, which a pilgrim is a traveler who's journeying to a holy place, or it could be named after some of the original developers or residents who were descendants of the original Pilgrim settlers. But we have no historical data to support that. Maple Avenue is pretty obvious. It was named after maple trees that it was once lined with, and it's a very charming neighborhood street name that fits right in with Millbrook's aesthetic. Haight Avenue, which is off of Maple Avenue, is named after Isaac Haight, whose farm Millbrook was built on. Weatherford Lane, which is a newer street off of Haight Avenue, I don't know if you know where that is. There's a lot of newer houses built on it. This is an interesting story from Peter, that when George Whalen Jr. was developing a new 10-lot subdivision off of Haight Avenue, he asked several of the real estate agents to think up some possible names for the new street. Peter Devers suggested Weatherford Lane in honor of a Colonel John Weatherford, who was the master of the foxhounds of the Melbeck Hounds. Which I don't know why it was called the Melbeck Hounds. Do you know?
The author Gordon Grant sort of thinly disguised real people and places. So Millbrook and Millbeck are pretty much the same thing. You've got a mill. Beck is another term for a brook, mostly used in England when it is a synonym. I think I mentioned to you that Dr. Mackenzie, who lived in the gray house on the other side of the library, was turned into Dr. McTavish, sort of changes in his fictional account.
Okay. And that's, like I said, that's a relatively new street in Millbrook also. Now we're gonna move over to Elm Drive. If we look at the old Sanborn maps, which were the fire insurance maps, which give us a lot of history of the Millbrook streets, we can see that this was referred to the street new up until around year 1898, when we see that it was named Elm Drive. It was at one point lined with multiple elm trees on either side, but there was the Dutch elm disease in the 1930s that killed all the trees and replaced them with what's there today. And then I have an old picture of Elm Drive. Pass it around. Okay, next we'll go to Church Street, which you're probably curious as to why it's called Church Street, because there's no churches on Church Street. But at one point it did house two churches. The Methodist Church, which is now a house. I'm sure you've driven by it plenty of times, this house right here. And the Episcopal Church, which is another building that was knocked down. It was in the parking lot kind of diagonal from Mitch's. I'll pass this on. You'll see that they took the steeple off, but other than that, it's pretty much still intact. Okay, now we'll move to Front Street. After the railroad was built, the new development soon followed it, and particularly along Front Street, where warehouses and businesses that relied on easy access to the railroad were constructed. This street's name is kind of obvious because it ran in front of the railroad, hence the name. It was at one point divided up into North Front Street and South Front Street, but I think they realized that calling it Front Street was easy enough and it wasn't necessary anymore. Along with Franklin Avenue, it became the commercial heart of the expanding community. Front Street then turns into Hart's Village Road just past the bookstore. Hart's Village was founded around a fast-flowing section of the Wappinger Creek, largely for its economical potential. The water power the creek generated was used to run a number of mills, several of which still exist along Hart's Village Road today, that produce flour, lumber, coffee, and cloth. The area was named for Philip Hart, the most prosperous of the mill owners, whose house stands today just west of the creek. And I think it's the house on the corner of 44 and Hart's
No,
Village.
it's my house.
Oh, sorry.
Second one in.
Second one in, okay.
Yeah.
Which, oh, I have a picture of that. Then we'll move to Reservoir Drive, was previously referred to as Reservoir Avenue, which makes sense because it runs parallel to all the other avenues in Millbrook, and it connects the streets. You're probably wondering where the name came from, since there's no visible reservoir on Reservoir Drive, but there actually is a small body of water behind it in the woods, which is probably where the name came from. Washington Avenue, we'll assume this was named Washington Avenue because we were in the town of Washington. Now we'll move to Alden Place. As many of you probably know, Alden Place housed many Irish and Italian immigrants. And in 1892, lots of the land were sold to Marie Weed Alden, who was the mother-in-law of Henry Davison, who's connected to Halcyon Hall, hence the name Alden Place. It was also referred to as Hogan's Alley. The Hogan family, who was a widow of the name Mary Hogan, lived on the street as well in 1900, owning 3 lots. However, the name most likely came from what was a new cartoon in the paper called Hogan's Alley, which was one of the many ethnic cartoons that appeared at the time, and I have a couple of pictures of it here. It was called Hogan's Alley. So I think it was just ironic that they probably picked up on the name of the cartoon and the street name. Okay. There was some friendly sports competition between the streets that were named after the streets. In the 1940s, there was a baseball team called the Hogan's Alley Wildcats who would play against the Front Street Raiders. So I thought that was kind of interesting that the streets had competition against each other. Now we'll move to North Avenue, which is off of Franklin Avenue. And we can see on the Sanborn map that it was originally called Shaw Street up until the year 1892, when the name changed to North Avenue. The name Shaw Street came from a Henry Shaw, who offered livery and boarding stables on that street next to St. Joseph's. And the street, of course, is north of Franklin Avenue, hence the name North Street. Fountain Place, which is off of North Avenue, was considered a relatively new street in Millbrook, being built between the years 1887 and 1892. We unfortunately don't know the origin of that street name, but assuming that there was a family with the last name Fountain that lived there. And then last but not least, we have a few street names named after some of the Italian families in Millbrook. We have Safari Drive, which is named after the Safari family, Bellectry Way, which is named after the Bellectry family, and Manzi Drive, which is named after the Manzi family. And that is as far as I could get with the street names. Does anybody have any questions?
People want to pass this around. These are the printouts of the sandbar maps that Ashley has a couple of up there. But these are interesting not just for the street names, but to look at some of the buildings that are there. These go from 1887 to 1913. And just after those maps, there's an old receipt from Henry Shaw, who Ashley mentioned, the blacksmith who had his place right up next to St. Joseph's Church up there. So this is a receipt from James Reardon of Reardon Briggs, right, from Henry Shaw. So if anybody wants to look through these,
I had a question to ask the group. Does anybody know how many grocery stores was in the Village of Millbrook when I was growing up, early 40s?
I think there was probably 4 or 5.
How about 7?
Oh, wow.
where were they all?
They were up there at the alley, Hogan's Alley, on the corner. There was an Italian store there, right on that corner. Then it turned into a barber shop, Tim's Barber Shop. You came down the avenue, past the old Woolley House, and down here Front Street, and there was Francis Dean, which is now Marona's. Come around the corner, and soon you get around the corner is where the wool place is now. That little small, that was A&B. You went past the funeral parlor, the next door, which is now the drugstore, was Jimmy Dunn's IGA. You went a little bit further up, came to the next corner, and that was down here, and that was the Grand Union. Across the street where the paper store is, and I can't remember that guy's name that had it, but anyhow, he had groceries in it. He had groceries in there.
Was that
You went down to the bank and went north to the end of that street, which is Merritt Street. On that corner was Mrs. Patron. She had an Italian store. That's 7 of them.
How much would their groceries that they sold overlap? Did they all sell the same stuff, or there were stores that specialized in different
like
things?
the one up in the alley, that was strictly all Italian stuff. And so was Mrs. Patron's
Patron's
place
down
down
here.
here. That was all Italian.
So would people go to both of the Italian ones, or they had loyalty to one or the other, or?
I really
It would work.
can't tell you.
They had loyalties.
There were loyalties
There
to
were
one or
definitely
the other?
loyalties, yeah. Depending on what families you were, close to. So, yeah, certain people only shopped at the Patrons down near the post office, and then certain people only shopped at Panazzo's up in the alley. It was very divided.
And did they have house
And
accounts?
now we have
Yeah,
more.
well,
House accounts?
Well, stores, if we count stores.
maybe,
it's
I don't
exactly-
know.
Yeah,
Groceries.
Marona's had house accounts up until COVID.
Right,
Oh.
that's when they stopped it.
Oh, they stopped it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. House accounts are, they're still good.
Any other questions?
If anybody's wondering why there were 2 Quaker meeting houses, the Quakers had a major split in 1828, and they're still trying to recover from that.
So when we say Church Street, I mean, the Quaker Meeting House is on the end of Church Street too, right? That's the entrance. The entrance is religious structure.
But Millbrook was at one point full of churches. It's kind of interesting just to think back about how many churches were here at one point.
That is
With the
interesting.
town involved.
Because a small population, given the number of churches.
Yeah.
That's true. I hadn't thought of that.
Did you say there was one where Charlotte's is, or did you say that was a church?
Oh, Charlotte's out.
Oh, Charlotte's
Yeah, way out.
Restaurant, yeah.
That was a church.
Yeah, that was it.
That's how the Federated Church formed, was these small churches didn't have the means to support themselves, so the Methodist Church, the Friends Church, and the, at that time, Dutch Reformed Church, under John Lyle, formed the Federation of Churches here at Lyle.
And the Reformed Church was down in South Millbrook, kind of by the monuments down there, which is a beautiful building. I mean, there's images of it that survive in this incredibly ornate and elaborate kind of wood carved steeple. That's just,
Tennis courts.
is that?
Right.
Yeah.
And that was George Hunter Brown, I think, who
Yeah.
paid for that church, the Dutch Reformed. Oh, you know that?
Don't know, but I know there's a plaque in the Lyle Church to him. Maybe he also helped
Yeah.
support the building of that in the late 1920s.
I don't think he was here then.
Oh, well.
George Hunter Brown only came, he was here like 8 years.
Oh, okay.
And then he went off to Paris. He was bankrupt.
Oh, really?
And he came back once, according to what I've read, he came back once to straighten some paperwork or something and never was seen again.
But he did, originally he donated a lot of money to the church.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he did things all over
Yeah,
Millbrook, kind of what became Millbrook. It wasn't even Millbrook when he
right,
left.
yeah.
But he led, was he even town supervisor for a year or something? He was right in there for those concentrated number of years and then left.
Are there other streets that we've overlooked?
How about Russell Knowles?
Oh, yeah, I couldn't find anything on,
We lived
Or
on Russell
Rodrigo
Knowles, and
Knowles.
I said, I don't know.
Well,
My
Rodrigo
daughter said,
Knowles
oh,
was
well-
named after Rodrigo's affair.
oh,
Right.
okay, I didn't know.
And that's in the town. It's not in the village.
Yeah,
Haight Avenue, that's mostly modern houses. It's
Yeah.
all new houses, really,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's not old.
no, but it was, I'm assuming it was named after Isaac Haight, anyway. Any other questions?
Well, I had just a comment that I wanted to make because I thought it was really interesting. Ashley mentioned Pilgrim Lane, which is the alleyway that runs from Maple, and today it ends at Friendly Lane, but it actually went from Maple all the way down to Front Street. When they moved the house, that's where Mrs. Martin lives now, the big house over here, which used to be here, when they moved that house, I don't know who moved it, but the people who moved it decided they didn't want the alleyway to run near their house, so they put up a blockage over on the side here to stop the alleyway. So I'm always wondering, like, where were the town fathers? Because this family just decided to block this road off, and it was fine, because today Pilgrim Lane only runs from Maple down to Friendly, and then it starts again behind this house, and it kind of runs down to Church Street, and then it gets kind of messy going behind Vernon Briggs, but,
Right, that's West Pilgrim.
right, West
Yeah, there's
Pilgrim.
one house on there.
But I mean, today you try to block a street off, I don't think that would work, but, you know, way back when, it was like, okay, we're gonna block the street, and that was that, so.
Who owned it? Was it public?
It was public, yeah, oh yeah, it's definitely a public
Laid
street.
out that way
Yeah.
initially, right?
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if they're still delivering coal and milk and ice.
Yeah.
They've been delivering milk. Well, when did they move the house?
They moved off Mackenzie's? Are you talking about the
The
Mackenzie?
blue house
Yeah,
right next to
yeah.
the library.
Yeah.
Do you know what decade it
Yeah, they
was?
moved the whole house. The house used to sit here.
Well, that must have been to build the library.
Yeah, so it must have been
So
the
whenever the library was
early
built.
1900s, right? Because the library was built in 1901
One.
or something?
Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah.
Was there a house?
It's, right here was the house that's next to it, the blue house.
Oh, the blue
They
house.
moved it to build the library.
That is interesting, because, so 1901, that's when they moved it and
Yeah.
blocked it off. They
Yeah.
were certainly delivering coal
Oh,
and
yeah.
milk and
Yeah.
ice then.
Yeah,
I wonder if we could find anything in the round table.
yeah, that could be interesting.
I looked a lot on the
Yeah,
newspaper
maybe
about
people were just
Pilgrim
like,
Lane, and
okay,
there's
well,
supposed to be a lot
fine
of
too, you can block the road and it-
Do you know? I don't know that.
I mean, if you look on the map, it doesn't seem like Pilgrim Way in the 1913 map goes all the way down. I don't know, it seems like it stops.
Yeah, probably.
So that would have been just after that, right, I guess?
Well, they moved the house probably around 1901, because that's when the library was built, so.
So that's reflected on the map.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know when the railroad stopped running through.
It was the 30s,
Oh,
right? I
30s.
mean, you
Yeah.
think so? No more than, I just know they're from like Katings and Mrs. Tilsley talking about, like 35, did they take it up?
39, they took up the tracks?
39, they took it up, maybe 35 it stopped, or the passenger stopped?
Passenger stopped first, you know.
Didn't they pull up the rails for the war effort?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they use that scrap metal, yeah. It's interesting to see like when, we're getting a little off track here, but that's okay. It's interesting to see like when railroads shut down, because you associate kind of the growth of automobiles in America in the 1920s, right? You think everyone's buying Model Ts and, you know, there's a huge boom in auto sales in the 1920s. They're so affordable. But it's really the 1930s when a lot of the railroads shut down, because that's when you have all these New Deal projects. And so much of that was building roads. And so you have to have the cars, but also the roads, and then you can shut the railroads down and they become less viable. So it wasn't really in the 20s, it was more like in the 30s and after that you see kind of the combination of these things leading to the railroad business becoming less viable and less
A little
relevant.
bit of a political
Yeah.
trend or something?
Yeah, I think it
Political.
needs to have a the city from here. That'd be very nice.
I just think it's interesting, like, when you think broadly about street names, not just in Millbrook, but anywhere. You've got a whole bunch of street names that are named after, like, physical features, right? Or specific locations, like Front Street or Reservoir Drive are kind of the examples of that in Millbrook. Or Wall Street, you know, down in New York City where the old Dutch Wall was, or places called River Road and stuff like that. And then you've got named after people, right? And we have a bunch of those in Millbrook. It's interesting though to think of like what people don't have streets named after them, you know, as well. Like there's no Thorn Street, right, or anything like that. And you have to wonder why that is, if that was a you know, conscious choice. And then there's the streets that are named like, you know, Maple and Elm that are kind of exercises in marketing and branding, and they just seem kind of generic and vaguely appealing to people who would want to live on a street that sounds nice like that. If you look up like the most common street names in America, those are close to the top, like Elm, Maple. If you go down south, you know what the most common street name is? Magnolia. Yeah. So those
What
are,
we don't have is Main Street.
we don't have, but everyone calls it
Yeah,
Main
my
Street.
grandmother called it Main Street.
Yeah, so even people from here, like Henry, did you ever call this Main Street or you just called it Franklin? Or
I used to go all the time.
you just called it?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I know.
that's interesting, yeah.
I think it would be interesting to find out more about, if we could find correspondence with Franklin Merritt. He came from Stamford, Connecticut, and he had family here. But he came in apparently and purchased the Haight Farm and developed it and then named the streets after him. But he purposely laid out the avenue that's wide and Pilgrim Lane behind it, and on the other side, it was really sort of state of the art at the time. And so it's purposeful. It's not an organically grown community, really. And he was from Stamford, and so I would just love to find, maybe down at the Stamford Historical Society or someplace, if anybody's ever given a collection of his
Because
correspondence.
I think he died there too, is what I found out.
Yes.
He ended up moving back there.
Yeah.
I remember Scott saying that Franklin Merritt was related to the Merritts of Merritt Parkway.
It is, and I completely, when I did that talk 2 years ago, I looked all into it. It's actually related to Merritt Bookstore too. There's a
Yeah,
whole
really?
long line, which we didn't know.
Scott.
But Franklin Merritt's son was Schuyler Merritt, and he became, congressman? He was maybe senator for the state of Connecticut, congressman, and they named the parkway after him, the Merritt Parkway. And then, for my personal end of it, Scott's father's name was Schuyler Merritt Meyer because they were cousins or something, and they liked the Schuyler Merritt name, and they used it. And it's come all the way down, because my son's name is Schuyler. And we didn't know that exactly, but it's kind of interesting to me. the personal thing.
And just thinking about like,
Who built it? Wasn't McHugh meeting road?
who are you, what's
That was
the
a guy.
So who built Halcyon Hall?
the architect or the guy who paid for it?
The guy who
Henry Davidson.
Which was just in relation to the lady that lived on Alden Place.
It was the worst possible timing to open
and he lost his mind.
a luxury hotel business. Opened in, I think, 1893, and the Depression of 1893 was the worst depression we've ever had in American history, other than the Great Depression. And unemployment was 20%, so people weren't really staying in luxury hotels.
Is it true that the architect of Halcyon Hall was the same architect who built Millbrook Renton House?
And built, if you ever go to Carnegie Hall, kitty corner across from Carnegie Hall is this beautiful old apartment building that he built as well, that you can kind of like look in the lobby and see. You know, so he did a lot of stuff in New York City too.
Who is the architect?
James Ware.
Oh, that is James
Yeah.
Ware, okay.
Who was Russell Knowles named after?
That I don't know.
So there's, I mean, there's the only Russell that I know about is that, so there's William Russell, who lived in the house on the corner of Church Street and Merritt, with kind of like the interesting little turret-like thing. I think it's like a construction office or something. And he worked at some point as a like the head gardener at the Dietrich estate, at the Hitchcock estate. But I don't know. And somehow he's related to like George Whalen's mother's family. But I don't know if it was named after that or not. But it's interesting too if you look at the maps, just in terms of like Allison was saying about the intentionality of how this was laid out. You know, there are a handful of places that have names on there that are unfamiliar to us. Like I think Ashley, you mentioned Shaw Avenue, which is North Avenue today. And then right on the map, it says after that name, arbitrary. So this is like, the road exists, but they haven't gotten around to formally naming it yet. I don't know what that process is, like if the village has to be involved in that, or the county, or whatever. But there's that one, there's the road that I live on is Valley Farm Road. On the map from 1913, that is labeled Minden Drive or Minden Lane or something like that, which is a term I never heard. But it says arbitrary, right? And so whoever was making these maps was conscious of like, you know, trying to identify what the names that people would use, even if they weren't official and records or anything like that.
Are you in the village where you live?
I'm still in the village.
Still
Yeah.
in the village?
Yep, the village goes up to almost like the entrance of
Yeah.
Hitchcock.
Right. It seems strange that northwest part of the village is nothing like the laid out planned community.
Right, and if you look,
Pre-existed, that was Hartsville.
That was Hart's,
Yeah.
right, over.
So it pre-existed.
So basically was Hart's Village merged with,
No, Hart's Village was absorbed
oops, that's what I meant.
by,
Yeah.
was absorbed, and just as Four Corners and South Millbrook and
Mechanic.
Mechanic.
little rest.
So there were the earlier hamlets, and then instead of selecting one for the railroad kind of went in between them all to service them all, and that's where Millbrook grew up and then grew out.
The other day, I went into the town hall to follow up on something, and they have a big map on the wall in there that shows the town of Washington, which is like perfect, you know, square, rectangle, close to a square. And then inside it, they have the Village of Millbrook, which, like you were saying, Susan, is not,
Yeah, you
A
can see
square,
on
not,
this red line
you know,
here.
They
and
never
there's,
did.
yes, that's what I'm getting to, yeah. And it's like there's part of it that kind of juts out to the west that almost looks like, you know, Tennessee, kind of jutting out from the rest. And the reason for that is when they were deciding the outline of the village, I guess back in 1895, 1896, when it was formalized, they wanted to make sure, the kind of powers that be wanted to make sure that the big estate owners were in the village. And so like the Dietrich estate, Hitchcock, is in there. The Thorne property is in there. The Wing estate, which is down like where the high school and the middle school are in there. And so those are like the kind of three key areas. which was a lot of undeveloped land, right? And those kind of mark the edges of the village, and then all of the actual development where we are right now is kind of constrained within that. And there's certainly a thought that that was done deliberately to limit the potential growth of the village, because you had this big, series of estates that weren't going to be developed, they weren't going to put in housing tracts there. And so all the development had to happen within this very limited area, which is why the population of the Village of Millbrook has been incredibly consistent over the last 125 years. And if you look at census numbers, since 1900, the population of the Village of Millbrook has been pretty static. And if you look at other villages that you might think are comparable, like Rhinebeck or something like that, those numbers have grown because they don't have this kind of constraint in terms of where they can be developed.
It's really interesting. Because Rhinebeck has certainly worked over the years to constrain or to keep out what they didn't want. I know, like Sally Mazzarella and all, there are some head honchos up there who really did a lot of work and had a good voice. But it's so interesting in Millbrook how it's developed. I mean, it's really a study.
And of those three big estates,
Three things.
one of them is gone and has been divided up, the wing estate, right? And so there are some houses down there on what would have been the wing estate. I mean, the whole development behind Kevin's house there, whatever that's called, Millbrook Hollow, right? That was part of that estate. But the Dietrich estate and the Thorne estate, they are still there. They have not been developed at all. So 2/3 of that kind of held with its original intent, essentially.
Well, the influencers wanted to continue to be able to influence the village.
Yes.
So that's.
Yes.
I remember reading an article from the late 1890s from the Millbrook Roundtable, and it was an annual report of the beautification committee or something for Millbrook, and it was stating how we were very pleased to see we have another 2 or 3 summer retreats up here, meaning the estates, and the architectural features are being enhanced on those streets like Merritt Avenue, and they were reporting on that. Another controlled sort of report. This is how we want our village to look. There it is.
Which reminds me, you should have Mary Rollins come and talk sometime. When she was supervising the project to coordinate all of the facades of the buildings along Franklin Avenue, there was a concerted effort to do that, and she was a designer in that process. That would be an interesting presentation.
This was in the 80s, I think.
Maybe the 90s?
Yeah, it seems like 90s maybe, yeah. That sounds right. Late 80s, 90s?
Yes.
That's
Because we moved in 84, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too.
I haven't thought of that in years.
I'm surprised, I wonder if there's any thought, I'm thinking about your theory of incorporating the large estates at kind of the different areas. I wonder if they ever thought of incorporating the Flagler estate, Edgewood. It's on the other side of the village line there, that would have protected the southern part.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to look at that. I can't picture the map exactly in my head.
Right directly across from the Golf and Tennis Club.
Yeah, but that's outside the village.
Golf and tennis clubs in the village.
And that's the border.
It's still,
Yeah.
yeah, I
So
just
they
can't
might
picture
go
where the
across the
exact
street.
borders of the village are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
across
In
the
that
gates.
part.
Well, that's it, that's the southern,
What the
Well, where the
clubhouse you're
clubhouse.
saying is the southern end.
yeah. And that was directly across from it. In fact, the clubhouse was donated by the Flagler family for, after they built it for a wedding, and donated it for, to the Golf and Tennis Club.
I'm trying to think about the timing, like when did the Flaglers first,
Yeah.
were they there?
Late 1800s, yeah. Yeah.
Maybe they figured Halcyon Hall was all part of it already.
Yeah, don't know, but that's an interesting thought on how to limit development by incorporating these large estates.
I wonder how when it got down to that point, how intentional they were. I know in Carline's book, his book, The History, he puts it across that they, you know, like January 1896 would have been, they suddenly realized, oh my gosh, we're a village now, we're incorporated, we have to do our own roads, be responsible for roads and taxes and whatever the utilities were, and they quickly put a map together. That's how Carmine writes it up.
Right.
They quickly had to, you know, scramble to get a map, so they just drew it around all the estates. But I don't know, you know, so it's kind of a curious thing. Yeah, was it?
It would be interesting to
How
know
intentional.
how those lines were formed.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the talk that I gave about the Lyle report, this is where I'm getting this from. The copy of the Lyle report, which is from 1913 that we have in the archives, was Lyle's actual copy of it, Reverend Lyle's actual copy. And there's this paragraph where basically the guy who wrote the report, who was an outside person who was brought in basically just to write this up, you know, he wrote a paragraph essentially saying what I just said, like this was a deliberate attempt to constrain growth, and specifically in the context of like, oh, we have a growing number of Italians here, and like we don't want them to have too much power. And in the margin next to that typed paragraph, Lyle wrote, I am not in agreement with this assessment, and signed his name. I think he was conscious of the political implications of saying something like that publicly. So it's an interesting little marginalia. Yeah.
I have a question, which I'm now thinking about, because Millbrook was a farm, as we know. The two main streets, Franklin and Merritt, were put in. And we assume, I mean, we have all these buildings today, but where did these people come from? How did they get these buildings, how did they get the town going? I mean, who came to build these buildings and who got people here to build these buildings after the two main streets were laid into the farm? Do we
That's
know?
an important question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know,
once the railroad comes and
Yeah, I think
Some people
some of
just-
it was businesses and enterprises in the surrounding hamlets
I see.
started to
Yeah.
move in to get closer
Yeah,
to
that
the
makes sense.
railroad.
Yeah.
Even when you think about, like, wasn't it Ginny Alderson's aunt and uncle who built the Birches, who built one house up on Maple, the one end of Maple, I think. So you know that, the stone where Ann still lives.
Oh, yeah.
yeah, so to Nan's point, if you look at the map from the 1860s, which is essentially the start of that process,
Yeah.
and if you look at the little hamlets, right, like Hart's Village, there are things labeled, you know, store this, store that, post office, and the same thing is true in Little Rest, and the same thing is true in Mechanic, and South Millbrook, and Mabbittsville, although that still exists to some extent. So yeah, I mean, I guess that those places close, you know, at that point, and those businesses move into a centralized location. I mean, I guess that probably does explain.
Another one, looking through some deeds, was right on Merritt. I think Oakley Thorne bought a parcel over there. I can't figure out exactly which one it was. And it had something to do with a gardener living there. The gardener was going to live there on Merritt Avenue. So maybe they also input, you know, built some of the housing.
And it seems like it's happening in the blink of an eye, but it's really happening over like a 25-year period we're talking about, right? From like 1865 to the early 1890s when most of this development is happening. So it doesn't just happen like instantly.
Right.
So,
That's a great picture.
guys, any other questions?
I wanted to pass stuff around, but I also wanted a poster board.
But
Yep.
last service,
There you are.
This is a much
just for
more
my classmate George Whaley, he died.
What do you teach? What age should
He
you
died at a young age, like 23. So I don't think it's ever been used.
was in,
Oh, it's a cute little place, yeah. No, the Perkins family didn't maintain it.
anyway, I said to the 7th grade teacher,
Yep.
I said,
Oh, sure, yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, we, oh, yeah, that was, part of it. It's starting to fill up again, so they leave it alone.
One thing.
They suspect it was a neighbor upstream.
Oh, one thing, otherwise it never happened. Yeah, he told me that.
It did, you know, it was just an awful thing for vandals to do.
Put it probably in the historical society.
Where'd you get this picture?
Did you email me?
Lempka. Lempka.
Sorry, I missed it. Why did you respond right away to, email?
Satara.
Oh, Satara.
From Satara's restaurant.
Yeah, I just know the Satara.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't, my father
well, hopefully,
was that generation.
neighbor
Yeah.